Good afternoon. I'm Dick Dirksen, and you're in tune with the Oregon Conference Camp Meeting online. We're talking about service, and today in our seminar, Matt Lucio from Peoria, Illinois. Is that right, Matt?
That is absolutely right. I'm in Peoria.
And is it a hot,
the
nasty
place
day?
where? No, it's probably like 82 out there today. It's absolutely.
That's the same as it is here in Portland. So, our topic is contemporary theology, and I think another way to say that, from having listened yesterday, is we're going to talk about how to communicate the gospel to people who really don't understand a whole lot about it, and to whom it may be a foreign language. Matt, yesterday we had an interesting challenge. We saw your face, we saw your lips moving, and we heard you as if you were in a far distant land.
Yeah.
Give me a quick summary of everything you said yesterday.
My wife would say that would be ideal. Okay, just everything. 30-minute video in 5 seconds. Here we go.
5.3 minutes. Ready?
Okay, so here's the real summary. We moved from Antioch to Athens. That's kind of the rhetorical framing device we're using to explain our current situation. Moving from what maybe is more technically we can call Christendom, which is a time in our place, a time in human history where Christianity dominates culture through the Middle Ages and up until recently, to post-Christendom, post-Christianity, which is where Christianity's influence in society is waning. It doesn't mean Christianity itself is waning. It just means its influence, its explanatory power in society is diminishing. And that's where we find ourselves in. So we're looking for a device to explain this shift, this cultural shift that we've all gone through. And I think we found that in Acts chapter 17.
And that's because Paul, at this point, has actually gone from Antioch, which is a fairly common Christian community, Seventh-day Adventist church on the corner. Paul and Barnabas are the pastors. Things are going well. And now they're in Athens. And Paul is trying to communicate to the people in downtown Portland who Jesus is.
Really want to shift from Antioch to Athens. Neither did Paul. He just happened to find himself there. But what's important, the important thing that Paul did was he accepted that he do not want to accept that we live in this world. We want to kind of pull ourselves back to the 1850s or 1950s, where it's a little bit cozier and more familiar to us. But here we are. We've got to deal with it. We've got to preach to the people in Athens just like Paul did.
I want to lay a challenge on you.
All right.
Let's assume things go really bad in the United States in the next 6 months.
Not a big assumption.
Not a big assumption. That economically we have 15 to 20 million people who suddenly are evicted, unable to pay their rent, unable to pay their mortgage, unable to keep the payments up on their vehicles, so they're not even able to sleep in their truck. We have a completely different world, and the people are not thinking about Christianity, they're thinking about food. And the arguments that are going on are heavy philosophical arguments about this and that, and who you're supporting and who I'm supporting. Sounds a lot like Athens to me. Where do you start to communicate Christianity and the basic message of Jesus?
Well, I would say this. There are certain segments of Adventism that wishes for bad times because they think that's when we can really connect with people.
That's true.
In the early 1930s, just after the Great Depression, there was an Adventist who wrote in the Review, I believe it was, and said that the Great Depression was the best thing that ever happened to America since World War I. And sometimes we can kind of enjoy these moments. I would say Athens is probably more akin to when things are going reasonably well, and people, the Greeks were very proud of their city, very proud of their tradition. They didn't think they needed anything. They didn't perceive any needs, certainly no felt needs. Now, obviously, if in your scenario, in some ways that's easy in that we don't usually wrestle with philosophical questions in a humanitarian situation. Usually we get to work. helping people, feeding people, housing people, and we show the gospel in that way, right? Their needs are closer to the surface, and so it's sometimes easier to address the needs when they're closer to the surface.
Was trying to figure a way to communicate Christ in Athens.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had started us off on his approach and how instead of standing up and preaching Christ, he spent his time listening to Athenians. Talk a little bit more about that, and then let's go to the presentation that you prepared for today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy to skip straight in the story to his sermon, right? Let's get to the good stuff. What does he say? How does he try to win them over? And I think if we do that, we miss the point that he spent the first little bit of his time in Athens, don't know how long, days, weeks, listening. He's going around looking at their different gods, trying to understand what's going on here. How does this whole system work? How does the life of the city work? Looking for an opportunity, like something can use.
And wandering through the statues, he finds one...
People who have a lot to say have the hardest time learning. One of the points we made in yesterday's video was that Jesus, if anybody had a lot to say, a lot of good things to say, it was Jesus, and yet he spends so much time listening. I mean, so many stories are somebody approaching him and asking him a question.
And so Paul is doing the same thing. He's listening.
I'm back.
You're back.
Not sure what just happened there. Just little crash.
We were hearing you. It's okay.
Oh, good. Fantastic. Well, anyways, Jesus spent so much time listening, and he's responding to people's questions. He could go around just saying, everyone else be quiet. I am God. I'm on earth for a short amount of time. Listen to what I have to say. And that would have been justified. But Jesus spent a lot of time listening. And I think that's instructive for us. I think when we get into an environment we're not as familiar with, such as post-Christianity, we should spend a lot more time listening than we spend talking.
So let's go ahead and listen to the presentation that you have made in to be shown today, okay? So for all of you who are tuned in, take a listen. Matt Lucio, and we're in Athens.
Hello everyone, welcome to my digital camp meeting seminar. My name is Matthew Lucio. I pastor in Peoria, Illinois, and this seminar is entitled Acts, Athens, and Apologetics. This is part 2. Now, the focus of our time together is to discover principles of proclaiming the gospel in a post-Christian world. Now, in yesterday's video, we talked about the need to embrace the changing world, just as Paul embraced the way his world changed when he moved from Antioch to Athens. And speaking of Antioch and Athens, those two cities stood as a metaphor for us for how our world has changed. When Paul was in Antioch, he was preaching to a primarily Jewish audience who shared his values and most of his faith. Paul's job was simply to update them on the new thing God was doing through Jesus. Now, the Greek philosophers of Athens, on the other hand, did not share much in common with Paul, so Paul had to preach an entirely different kind of sermon in Athens. Now, of course, he didn't compromise his beliefs, but he did change his approach in order to win them to Jesus. The way he explained what he believed changed, not what he believed. The case I want to make to you throughout this seminar is that we don't live in Antioch anymore. We live in Athens. And so the way by which we convey our beliefs is going to have to be tuned to the world we live in. We have a much more hostile culture, and we will have to back up, as Paul did, and start from the beginning. Tomorrow, in the final presentation that we are going to share together, we're going to put it all together. We're just going to wrap it up with a nice little bow. We're going to apply it to the world that we live in. In this presentation, right here, right now, right where you are, we're going to look at the nuts and bolts of what Paul said and did in his Athens sermon. I call it Of Walls and Bridges. Now, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, I want you to hang on to them, write them down, write them in the comments below, whatever. We'll get to them in the end. So let's get started. How exactly did Paul reach the people of Athens? What was his strategy? Before we even study his sermon, one thing is apparent, should be apparent to us. Paul got noticed. The Bible says he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Now, when Paul wants to speak to the Jews, he goes to the synagogue. You know where to find the Jews in these Greek cities. If he wants to reach the people of Athens, we have to place ourselves where the people of Athens will hear us. Paul didn't just expect them to walk into the synagogue, nor should we expect the people of Athens today to walk into our church. Adventists understand this. Back in the 1920s, we realized radio could be used to spread the gospel. So Adventists caught the vision, even helped HMS Richards buy radio time in Los Angeles by sending him their gold fillings and their jewelry. But where did they get the jewelry? Anyways, Voice of Prophecy was born, and as TVs began to appear in the 1930s, we dismissed them until Faith for Today showed us that television could be used to preach the gospel as well. They didn't just show us, they showed the world because they were the first coast-to-coast religious television show ever. That's cool. So suddenly it was okay to have a TV, right? You have to support the church. Go buy a TV. By the time we get to the 90s, we have Mark Finley and others doing these net meetings over satellite. Suddenly TV wasn't enough. The churches had to buy these $3,000 gigantic satellite dishes. Many of you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, now we have the internet. And Adventists have been making pretty good use of the internet. There are more than 50 billion devices connected to the internet today. Adventists understand the need to shift, to use the technology of the moment to proclaim the good news about Jesus, because it's how we find our audience. We know how to adapt. Adventists have done a great job realizing that, hey, people are gathering around their little radio set now. We should be there. We should meet them there. And then they did the same thing with TV. Then they did the same thing with satellites, then they did the same thing with the internet, and then social media. So you've probably noticed in those examples I gave that the frequency of having to adapt to new platforms to find new audiences has increased. We jumped on radio in the 1920s. 20 years later or so, we got on TV. 40 years later, we started using satellites. And just a few years after we started using satellites, that's when we jumped onto the internet. So it's now the year 2000, you survived Y2K, and you have a web page, a great web page that looks like this. There you see it. Millennium of Prophecy, Amazing Facts, a satellite evangelistic series in the year 2000. Now we can rest and we don't have to change for a while, right? Oh wait, now it's 2006 and YouTube and Facebook are being founded. They're coming into being, and now we have to adapt to social media. The pace of change is increasing, but we have to keep putting ourselves where the modern people of Athens can hear us. It is a missional imperative. Where did Paul go to be heard? He went to the agora, or marketplace. It was the town square back when it meant something to have a town square. The town square back then, it was your Walmart, where you went to go get food and clothes. It was also where you went to go see friends. It was the social center of the city. Once a year, the citizens of Athens gathered in the agora to vote. If the people of Athens thought that an elected leader was behaving too much like a dictator, they could vote to exile that leader from the city for 10 years, which is not a bad use of democracy, if you ask me. The point being, the agora was the life of the city, and it's there that Paul went to speak. He didn't go to where he wished the people would be. He didn't go out into the country and say, man, I wish they'd come out here. He went to where the people were. He went to the heart of the city and he got noticed. He got noticed by Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Mission accomplished. You may have learned that the Epicureans were all about enjoying life and doing whatever brings you joy, and the Stoics were all about self-discipline. I don't know what this hand motion, like, am I milking a cow? What does that have to do with Stoics? Anyways, that's an exaggeration of both groups. Epicurus did believe that the meaning of life was pleasure, but he advocated it in moderation. Epicurus believed that if we overdo pleasure, then it won't be pleasurable. It leads to pain, which is the great evil they want to avoid. If you drink too much, you end up throwing up. That's not fun. Besides, Epicurus was more focused on intellectual pleasure than bodily pleasure. He encouraged people to be single, to not get involved in politics, and to not fear the gods, because if you're afraid of the gods, well, that's not pleasurable, right? The opposite of pleasure is pain, and so we must minimize pain as much as we possibly can in life. One of the most famous lines in this little tombstone pick-me-up. I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. That kind of just summarizes his feelings. The Stoics, on the other hand, were actually named for a place in the Athenian agora where they used to meet. They believed that the mature person, the sage, was someone who could not be moved by the world around them. The Stoics practiced virtue. They believed that God directs the universe down to the smallest detail. The Epicureans, in contrast, believed that God was too busy enjoying his eternal life to bother with us. In Stoic theology, two words are often used to describe God. He is the logos and the pneuma, the word and the breath, or spirit. Those words appear out of nowhere in the New Testament, don't they? Well, this is a very brief look at these two groups, and knowing this will prove invaluable as we dive deeper into Paul's sermon today and tomorrow. Okay, so Paul wants to speak to the thought leaders in Athens, these Epicureans and Stoics and others. So he shows up where the people are, and it works. He gets invited. Now, the Stoics and the Epicureans who do meet him are completely and utterly unimpressed. They don't understand what Paul is talking about. They began to debate with him. Some call him something like a hayseed, or honestly, it's probably better to translate it as a hillbilly. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. And this must have been a humbling moment for Paul. He was a giant among the Christians, and we can say well known among the Pharisees back home. But in Athens, he was a nobody. The God he was talking about was called foreign. Human beings have really weaponized the word foreign, haven't we? When Zipporah gave birth to a son, Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. And so God commanded his people in Exodus 22, verse 21, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. The Greeks, like the Israelites in Jesus' day, divided up the world between natives and foreigners. And that's why it really is significant that Jesus asked this question or made this comment in Luke chapter 17. Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Jesus was holding a mirror up to the people that he was talking to. What matters, Jesus was suggesting, is not where a man was born but whether or not he knows God. So stop dividing up the world this way between those who share your culture and traditions and language and those who don't. That distinction doesn't mean anything. Paul himself probably shared that viewpoint once, back when he was a Pharisee of the Pharisee. And now he felt what it was like when you were the outsider. So this label of foreigner, it was a wall that was built to protect the comfort of those on the inside. But Paul didn't care. He was here to build bridges, and when you've come to build bridges, you sometimes have to bust through a few walls. Apparently, the philosophers thought Paul was interesting enough that they brought him to the rest of the philosophers who were gathered on the Areopagus, which is a hill next to the marketplace, next to the agora. It's more of like a giant boulder, but whatever. We don't know exactly what Paul was saying in the marketplace, except that we were told he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Once Paul arrived at the Areopagus, he was met with curiosity. I mean, look at verses 19 and 20. May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. There's a little note of judgment in there, right? I mean, his ideas are called strange, and earlier they're called foreign. They don't rightly belong here, but there's also that curiosity. They want to hear more. Sometimes the people of the world are more interested in us than we are in them. Do you think the elders in Jerusalem would have listened to the Stoic philosophers that they had come to visit? Let's just go ahead and say probably not. But you'll notice that Luke isn't exactly a fan of Greek curiosity. In verse 21, he pens this parenthetical statement for us. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Now, Paul's trip to Athens is not the first time an educated Jew interacted with Greek philosophers. They may not have regarded each other very highly from a spiritual point of view, but Paul isn't the only one to try to reach out. It didn't seem to ever end well, however. When Darius the Great ruled over Persia and Israel, one Hermippus of Smyrna, which is an awesome name, Hermippus. Anyways, he accused the famous Pythagoras of, quote, imitating and transferring to himself the opinions of the Jews. Anti-Semitism, surely one of humanity's most timeless prejudices. And it didn't stop there. Another Jew ran into Aristotle. We all know Aristotle. And Aristotle noted that this Jew critiqued Greek philosophy and, to quote Aristotle, communicated more information than he received from us. In other words, this Jew met one of the most famous philosophers in human history, but came there to meet him to talk more than he came to listen. Now, Paul did not come to debate philosophy. He came to use philosophy to win their hearts for Jesus. But there was these ancient walls there between the Jews and the Greeks that Paul would have to break through if he wanted to build a bridge to them. So how did he do it? He did it in 4 ways, okay? The first way is very clear, may already be clear to you. The first step in Paul's plan of evangelism there in Athens is to meet his audience where they are. He did that by going to the agora, but he also is going to do that in what he said in his sermon. We talked yesterday about Paul's opening words in verse 22. Men of Athens, I see that you are very religious in all respects. For as I went around and observed your objects of worship, We all know that Paul was really deeply disturbed by these idols, but he doesn't tell them that. He doesn't go off on them for their idolatry. Paul is upset, yes. And it takes a really mature person to learn how to set those emotions aside and smile and compliment people for being very religious, even when you think their religion will send them to hell. Okay, this is an important skill to learn. Now, Paul says he observed their objects of worship. The Greek word here is anatheoron, and as one Greek lexicon puts it, it means to observe closely and give serious consideration to. And then that lexicon adds this note. Paul was not merely looking at the objects of worship, but was undoubtedly thinking about the implications of them. What Paul is doing here is marvelous. He likely knows that Jews and Greeks have interacted philosophically in the past, and he probably knows that very little headway has been made. Both come from very proud cultures with rich sources of theology and thought and art, and it's hard to come at this conversation from a place of humility because you don't want to show weakness, right? I'm proud of my ancestry. I want you to be unproud of yours and join me, okay? Both sides are not going to budge very easily. Obviously, you think your culture and beliefs are better than the other guys, of course, and you don't want to give that up. It's hard to make any progress in that situation. But what Paul does here is marvelous. He begins by admiring what the Greeks have. It's disarming, but not dishonest. Paul doesn't say, oh man, I love the craftsmanship of your gods. I mean, just really well done. There's so much I admire about your belief system. Look, he's not patronizing them, nor is he looking for something superficial or shallow to start a conversation with. I see y'all got the new iPhone made out of granite. So much better than the one made out of marble. Am I right? Paul's a genius, and I think the Spirit is really guiding him in this story. He compliments them in a way that they would feel honored by. You guys are very pious. You are truly serious about honoring your gods. Paul isn't approving of their idolatry. He's approving of their piety, and that's an important distinction. Sometimes you will encounter people who very obviously have made life choices you don't agree with. It reminds me of this commercial, this insurance commercial that's going around these days. And the premise of it is this expert is going to help you not turn out like your parents. And there's this scene where he walks a few of these patients through a store and they see somebody walking by with this crazy blue hair, and he holds them back. He holds his patients back. We all see it. But one of his patients just can't help himself. He just blurts out, blue hair. Right? He just had to say it. They saw something that annoyed them, or it was out of the ordinary. They had to just call it out, right? They couldn't help themselves. But look, we can help ourselves. We can look past the superficial stuff. You can look past the idols. And if you want to strike up a conversation with someone, compliment them in a way that they would value. And if you need to practice, man, just go sit on a bench at a park and watch people in an interesting way, not a creepy way. And think to yourself how you might compliment each person who passes in a way they might value. Meet them where they are, not just in terms of your physical location, but find a way to meet them in a way that matters to them. Chances are their defenses is up. They don't know you, right? The wall is there. So disarm them with a comment that shows you're listening, that shows that you're paying attention to what matters to them and that you care about them. So step one, meet them where they are. You've humbled yourself by coming to them. You've disarmed them by showing that you care about them. Step two is about building that bridge. You cannot build a bridge until you've disarmed them with love. I mean, have you ever tried to build a bridge under enemy fire? That was a rhetorical question because I seriously doubt any of us have ever tried to do that. But I imagine that that would be something that is not likely to succeed. Anyways, moving on. Acts 17, verse 23. This is what it says. For as I went around and observed closely your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship without knowing it, this I proclaim to you. Well, look, as Paul was anger walking through Athens, he finds this one statue to the unknown God. The Greeks were worried that there might be a God out there that they failed to show proper respect to, and that God may get angry and punish them. And this is the great insecurity of polytheism, isn't it? You just never know. You never know if you are in good standing with the gods. There are just so many of them, and they don't exactly care to reveal themselves all of the time. This, I think, is why Paul compliments them on their piety. It's not just an attitude that our gods are better than yours. You only make a statue to the unknown God when you sincerely want to show respect to the divine, when you want to show respect to everyone's gods. Now, Paul uses that and announces that he has come to tell the Athenians all about this God that they don't know. Again, genius, because what are they going to say? No, Paul, I think the God you're describing, that's not the unknown God. I mean, they can't say anything because it's an unknown God. They don't know anything about it. So it's the perfect way to build a bridge to them. Later on, of course, Paul will be quoting from their philosophers. He's not quoting Moses. He's quoting from their team to show that we have some truths in common that maybe we never realized. Paul is looking to build, to find, to point out some common ground. To go a little bit deeper, Paul is building a bridge by entering their world or their worldview. Imagine you are a missionary on an island where the people worship the sun, moon, and stars as gods. You probably won't get anywhere by saying, those gods are false, just giant balls of gas in the sky, except for the moon. Let me tell you about the true God who came in human flesh and died for us. Rather, you have to probably explain what you believe in terms that they're going to understand. How might you reach them? You might begin with, there is a great sky god who rules over the sun, moon, and stars. He is the great creator. We might flinch at that kind of language here in Christendom, or even in our post-Christendom, right, where Christianity is still very popular. But you have to look at it from their perspective. They're not ready to understand the mystery of the incarnation, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. The bit about the sky god is just a framing device so that you can take their entire theological worldview and place it in a context that they can understand. I mean, you mean my sun god isn't the most powerful being in the universe? Yes, that's what I mean. And then you can go tell them about your God, right, as time goes on. I think you get the general idea here. You often have to explain something in a way your audience will understand from their worldview, from their perspective, in the language that they use. You have to introduce what you believe in a way their worldview can accept. We actually already know how this works. Have you ever heard the old bear saying, if it's black, attack, if it's brown, lay down, if it's white, good night? Have you ever heard that, like hiking or whatever? Well, people debate how true it is. Let's not get into that. But let's assume it's true for the moment. We are told that when you encounter a brown bear, you should lay down and play dead. Why? Because in the bear's worldview, such as a bear has a worldview, that means you're not interesting. You're dead, you're lifeless, you're limp, they don't want to eat you. Black bears are more easily intimidated into walking away, so you should make yourself big, loud, scary, and they'll conceivably run away. As for polar bears, the moral of the story is to fast and pray, which in this case means pray very fast and hope for a miracle. Underneath all of this advice is the idea that you have to enter the bear's worldview. You have to see yourself as the bear sees you. You have to appear in a way that they would understand, and that is bear missionary work. You see this in the Chronicles of Narnia as well, specifically the first book. The story is about some children who wander through a wardrobe into Narnia, where they meet a lion named Aslan who created the world and who will eventually sacrifice himself to save them, rising again after a few days. I'm really sorry if I spoiled the plot for you, but the books have been out for 70 years. So, yeah. My point is that C.S. Lewis is basically telling the Jesus story with metaphors and imagery that children would understand. He is entering not so much a worldview in the case of children, but their world, right? How does a Jesus story, how could it be understood from their eyes? Jesus does this in Luke chapter 5. Jesus does this a lot, but here in Luke 5, this is how Luke describes it. Now Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing around him to hear the word of God. He saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then Jesus sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and lower your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing, but at your word I will lower the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets started to tear. Peter's whole world is fishing. So Jesus appeals to Peter from the world of fishing by showing himself to be the master fisherman, right? This builds credibility with Peter. Peter gets this. Peter gets this. How does Paul enter their worldview? Well, as we said, he's going to present his God as the great unknown God the Greeks were already worshiping. He has entered their world, uses their language, and explains his God in terms they can understand. He tells them, the God that is unknown to you is known to me. So let me tell you, everybody wants to be filled in, right? Nobody wants to be ignorant. We all want to learn what we're missing. And this is what Paul is appealing to here. He has built a bridge to them. And in this moment, the Jewish and Greek worlds are now linked. They've been bridged through this idea of the unknown God. And this approach really requires empathy. You really have to understand how the other person thinks. You have to know them. You have to have listened to them. All right. First step was to meet them where they are. Second step is to build a bridge. Third step Paul takes is to paint a compelling picture of God. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives life and breath and everything to everyone. I love that. Everything to everyone. From one man he made every nation of the human race to inhabit the entire earth, determining their set times and the fixed limits of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move about and exist, as some, even some, of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. So since we are God's offspring, we should not think the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human skill and imagination. This is the heart of Paul's message. This is the unknown God Paul has come to proclaim. Notice how Paul begins. He is the creator and Lord, this God. He does not live in temples, nor does he eat human food, because he doesn't need anything from us. And this was meant to be a relief to the Greeks, who had to constantly offer food offerings to their gods to satisfy them and build elaborate temples to please them. This God doesn't need those things, Paul says. He doesn't need you to do anything for him. You don't need to support him. He, the creator, supports you. So why did this God create humanity if he doesn't need us? so we can serve him because he was bored one day? Well, the Greek creation stories often involve Zeus getting mad at human beings, even though they didn't do anything wrong, right? He gets mad at them because Prometheus stole fire and brings it to them, so Zeus punishes them. Humanity gets punished by having a woman being sent to them. Let's not get into that right now. So, Paul, is this going to be one of those stories? Nope. Paul says that this God created man so that they would search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, even though he is not far from each one of us. This God is a God who wants to be found. He wants to be known. We were created to connect with this God, not to blindly serve or support him as his slaves. Even better, this is where Paul quotes his Greek philosophers. First up, Epimenides, nailed it today. Woo! Anyways, who in Titus Paul calls one of their prophets. He quotes Epimenides, in him we live and move and exist. Epimenides was talking about Zeus when he wrote this, but Paul is redirecting that line to refer to his God, not to Zeus. It was a line that originally referred to the immortality of Zeus. And in context, it read, "They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one. Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies," for saying that Zeus was mortal. "But you are not dead. You live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being." Now, Paul quotes the part about people from Crete being liars in Titus, and let's not get into that right now. And he quotes that last line here in Acts. What Paul is saying by using these quotes is that your guys were really pointing towards my God all along, right? Your prophet, your poet was really looking forward to my God. He was just a little confused, right? So does that God pique your curiosity? Do you want to know more about the God who wants to be known? Paul is not proclaiming a small God. He's not telling them that they missed the God of Maltese dogs. You could probably ignore the Maltese God just like you can ignore Maltese dogs. Paul is actually proclaiming a big God, the biggest God. There's a subtle challenge here against Zeus. I mean, Zeus can just be ignored, right? The Greeks had thousands of temples and shrines dedicated to their gods. And Paul is saying this God isn't captured in any of the idols that you can build. He's too big for that. Nor does this God need you to sacrifice your animals or your money to feed him. Temples cost a lot of money, take a lot of time to build. This God doesn't need you in order to exist just fine. Paul portrays God in ways a pagan might wish to be true. I don't have to build these huge temples to this new God. I don't have to constantly serve him lest he be angry. And Paul ends this part with saying, God gives life and breath and everything to everyone. God is not a taker, he's a giver. And knowing God should not be a burden on people. He isn't just our creator, he's our sustainer. Paul doesn't just directly attack the Greek gods, but he shows how irrelevant they are by ignoring them. They don't look good compared to this God. And if this one God is our creator and sustainer, then we don't need any other gods. Then Paul quotes Aerith, who was a Stoic, by the way, to really thrust his point home. Some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Well, Aerith was also talking about Zeus, and Paul again intercepts this and redirects that comment towards his God. This God didn't just create and sustain us and want to be known by us, but we are in fact his children. Can you imagine what that must be like to worship all these temperamental, impersonal gods and be told, there's a God out there who wants you to find him because you are his children. And now Paul turns that thrust sideways when he says, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. This all began with idols, and Paul finally makes his case for why idolatrous images are wrong. They're wrong because we are God's children. We are the image of God in the world, not some piece of stone or silver. Paul doesn't attack idols as the thing that is going to send you to hell. He reasons with them kindly, winsomely. Aerith, your guy, not mine, said, we are all God's children. Shouldn't we listen to him? There's a theologian named James K.A. Smith, and he recently wrote some books with a provocative idea. He said that we often think of ourselves as thinking animals. Scientists tell us that our reason, right, is the only real difference between us and the animals. But Smith says, no, Human beings are more than just thinking and believing animals. At our core, we are what we love, not just what we profess to believe. Which is why when you drive past McDonald's, the thought jumps to the front of your brain, yum, calories. But then your frontal lobe wakes up, hey, I'm not suicidal. Why do I want McDonald's? Right? It's our instinctive wanting that kicks in first, and our higher reasoning that comes in second. This is what Smith writes. What we love is a specific vision of the good life, an implicit picture of what we think human flourishing looks like. Now, that could be money and sex and drugs, or the good life for you could be a nice porch in the country with your Bible. But we instinctively chase that good life, that thing that we love, that thing that we want. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Now, we can tell ourselves one thing. We can hide it and put on a good show, but we desire what we desire. So the goal is to train our desires. And I think one of the most important things we could do as Adventists is offer the world a picture of the good life with God. Because I believe only when you follow God faithfully will we flourish as human beings and reach our potential. If our message is, believe this truth or else, it's not a very compelling story. It's not a compelling picture of God. People today want a good story. They want to be a part of something beautiful. They want to chase after beauty. And I believe we are part of something beautiful, but we don't always present it that way. To quote from Smith again, he says, it is not primarily our minds that are captivated, but rather our imaginations that are captured. And when our imagination is hooked, we are hooked. Paul in Athens is presenting a beautiful picture of what God is like in hopes of hooking his hearers, of getting them interested, of drawing them in. So how do we talk about God when we talk about God? Are we painting a picture of God as a supreme grouch, doesn't let you do things? Or as a divine ultimatum? Is that who God is? Do this or else. Are we portraying him as the impatient parent? Like he's just tired of us down here? Are we describing him as the Disney sop who just wants you to be happy, man? Now, look, God is diverse, and there is some room to talk about him in a truthful way that appeals to people that we are talking about. If you're talking to an artist, maybe you could emphasize God's creativeness, his love of beauty. If you're talking to an engineer, somebody with a more orderly mind, you can talk about God's justice and order and his purpose in the world. In order to paint beautiful pictures of God, however, we have to really know God. We not just know about him. We have to experience him, to know the many sides of God, and to love him. This is where we're going to leave it today, however. I have one more step in Paul's strategy to reach the philosophers of Athens that I will share with you tomorrow. And then we're going to wrap it up with some application for our present context. So you'll have to come back and see how it ends. I hope this content challenges you. I hope it gets you thinking. I hope it gets you excited. I hope you come to see yourself as a missionary in this place. Think about it as we pray. Father God, again, we turn to you. We see the intricate little cogs and wheels and turns and thrusts in Paul's sermon in Athens, Lord, and it is beautiful, the lengths to which he went to reach them there. But even what Paul did in Athens, Lord, is nothing compared to the lengths to which you went to reach us. You, Lord, came to where we were. Jesus was found in human flesh. You came to meet us, and you came to build bridges with us, and you came to show us the Father, this beautiful, compelling picture of God, so that we would be irresistibly drawn. If a being like that exists, I want to be with that being. Like the idea of who you are is just so captivating. It's like, why would we want to turn to anything else? You've done those three things, Lord, that Paul did in Athens. You did that in our lives as well. And we're just thankful that you care about us enough to do that, to spend the time, to give your life, to want to win us back. That we weren't created just to serve you, just to keep your commandments or else. We weren't created to worship you because you just love hearing your name being spoken. You're selfish or prideful like that. It's none of those things, Lord. I love that we were created to know you. We were created for family. We were created for connection. We were created to be together. And it breaks our hearts that we're not together in this moment. Well, in the short time, Lord, that we have between now in that glorious reunion that we await. Help us, Lord, to continue that ministry of reconciliation, as Paul calls it elsewhere, of reuniting people to their God. Help us to invest in that effort, not just to throw literature at them, not just to throw slogans at them, Lord, but really to invest in them because we want to see them whole. We want to see them happy and flourishing in you. That is our heart, Lord, because it is your heart. And we pray, Lord, for fill that heart up again today. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. I know you guys have been hanging on to some questions. I think we're going to get to those in just a few seconds. So hang on.
Thanks, Matt. Man, fascinating, and you've really kept me thinking. In fact, you've opened some doors I hadn't looked through for a long, long time. So, Matt, as I look at that and as I listen to your description of all of it, there's two questions that come to me. One first is, you made the point that if I'm going to talk about this God, I've got to know this God, that it's not knowing about, not being able to describe, but actually having a relationship with. How important is that, and how do you make sure that happens before you go out and start teaching?
Yeah. I think it's really important. I think it serves us to differentiate between two kinds of knowing God. I mean, I think we have the individual knowledge of God, our own experience, our own history with God. But I think we also have the communal knowledge of God. There are ways we talk about God as Adventists that are unique or common to Adventists. Like they get passed down, right? So I may read it in a George Knight book, and then I start talking about God that way. And then I teach my kids, and they start talking about God that way. So I think there's two ways in which we know God, and both of them are important. It's not enough for me just to know God really, 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 really well. I mean, that's good if it's just a one-on-one situation. But when we talk about what Adventists typically do with public evangelism, when we talk about God almost coming from a communal setting, it's a group of Adventists, maybe one teacher, but there's a group of Adventists in that church who are part of this evangelistic process. It matters that we know God richly together, and that's going to mean to me what we found out about God when we go through hard times. Like if somebody hasn't had their long dark night of the soul, I don't know that I trust them to talk in depth about God. I think you have to wrestle with God at some point in your life, and I think until you get to that point where you've really wrestled with Him, just like Jacob with the angel, and overcome, then I think, to me, that's one marker. And it doesn't just happen once in your life. It happens several times, many times. That's a marker that you're getting to know Him, and not just getting to know Him through the words of other people.
Let's go back to Paul for just a minute. After Saul became Paul, he met Jesus, of course, went through the process at Damascus. One of the first things that happened is Ananias, who had to be one of his explainers to help him understand God. He didn't just take the scale, he didn't just pray the scales off of his eyes. They must have spent a lot of time conversing and trying to argue this and that so that Paul would understand who God really was. And then he sent him off into the desert. It seems to me that Paul did a really bad job of trying to communicate Christ to the people in Damascus, even after he came back from the desert.
Yeah.
And then he goes back to the desert again. Then he gets sent all the way back to Tarsus for a whole bunch of years. And after 10 years over there, suddenly God says, okay, I think you got it now. Is it okay for me to think that I need some time before I can really do this effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's ever a moment in our walk with God where we ever say, okay, now I get it. I mean, I think if we're always growing and evolving with God, can we say the word evolving? Are the sensors going to beep that out? Anyways, as we're growing with God, there's never a moment where we get it. But I think the growth is the point. And I think you bring up Paul's desert experience. My own thought on that is that Paul had a hard time at first, in part because he hadn't grown enough, but I think also in part because that wasn't where he was supposed to be. Like, Paul's calling was to the Gentiles. He didn't realize that at first. But you know what I mean? It's kind of like with Ellen White's son, Edson. The guy just really didn't do anything in Adventism until he heard someone make an appeal. Hey, we need people down south to work among the freed slaves. And just suddenly religion got real to Edson, right?
Right.
Like he was just waiting for that call. And then suddenly it all clicked and he was gung-ho.
And he had somebody to talk about because the God who called him to talk to people who would understand him.
That's right. That's right.
Question that comes, Paul obviously had spent a lot of time studying Greek philosophers, and he understood Epicurus and all of the rest of them, and he understood where Zeus came from and all the child and this and that. What should I be reading?
I mean, there's multiple ways to approach this. Okay, Paul went the philosophical route. It doesn't mean that everybody has to get into the philosophy of the age. But if you want to do that, Charles Taylor is the place to go these days. There's plenty of other good Christian philosophers right now, but Charles Taylor is the one who's driving the conversation philosophically. But that's not the only way you can approach this in wrestling with post-Christianity. That's just the philosophical route. You could deal with it in terms of other aspects of our culture, morality, for instance, or politics, or whatever. There's multiple ways to approach this question. And in each of those different fields, there's going to be, I think, literature that will kind of get you started.
So Paul is an extrovert. Paul must have just about died during his time in the desert when all he had to talk to was maybe a few of the priests up at, in Petra, or who knows, maybe there's nobody to talk to. He must have just about died up there. Yeah. I'm not going to be that much of an extrovert. In fact, what happens if I'm an introvert? I can go to any group and be quiet the whole evening. How do I witness in Athens?
Yeah. I do agree Paul was probably an extrovert. I don't know that an introvert couldn't have pulled off what he pulled off. Because you think about it, the first step required study. It required listening, which is something introverts can be good at naturally. And the second part is, I'm a pastor and I'm an introvert. A lot of pastors are introverts. We don't necessarily relish the public upfront aspects of our job, but we do them. And I think what helps doing them is that I get to be the one preaching. So I think when an introvert has something interesting to talk about and think about, I think we can engage publicly. It's not that we can't do it. It's just that being an introvert, it means that stuff drains you. Mm-hmm. It doesn't energize you like it does an extrovert. So, I mean, Paul got to study and he got to talk on his own terms and talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. And it was something interesting. I think what kills us introverts is like small talk with no purpose. It's just not interesting. It's boring, and it just sucks the life out of us. So I think an introvert could have done what Paul did in Athens.
I don't understand how that would be possible, though, because an introvert is the kind of guy who's going to watch Paul do it, not to actually start the conversation.
Well, Paul definitely had the motive. I would imagine, because I'm more timid than Paul, I would have wanted to just stay at the hotel and wait for your friends, right? Just take this as an opportunity to relax a little bit, get some reading done, go to the beach. Well, I keep the beach in Athens, but you know what I mean. That's definitely how I would have been tempted to look at it. And it may have been what Paul would have done had he not seen the idols and been provoked by them. But look, I don't mind speaking to a gathering of people. If the mayor and the city council here in Peoria wanted me to come talk about something, as long as it was something I was interested in and felt very strongly about, I think I could pull that off. It's just if they want me to come talk about something boring, it would just kill me.
So I'm thinking through all of this about the neighbors that I have in my neighborhood. And one of my neighbors is Jewish, and he actually runs a Jewish radio station here in Portland, Oregon. And his whole goal is to keep a conversation going that will help Americans understand the true Jewish heart. Mm-hmm. And they talk about absolutely everything. He interviews everybody you can imagine. He does all kinds of news reports on interesting things going on in America, but always from a Jewish perspective. Is that what a Christian does?
So is that what a Christian does or should do?
Should do. Is that what a good Christian evangelist in Athens?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not one to buy entirely into identities as the only Christianity is the only lens to see the world. I mean, I think if you're going to play a video game, you can play a video game, and you don't necessarily have to do it as a Christian. But I do think that's what we have to offer the world. And I think that's what we have to offer the Athens that we live in. Because, as we're going to talk about more tomorrow, I know that's your favorite thing that I get to say, but our society right now, our secular society, is locked in what Charles Taylor is going to call the immanent frame. In other words, they're focused on this life. They don't look beyond it. If you're going to find meaning, you're going to find meaning only in this life. Like, there's no transcendent values. And I think what we have to offer them is, a deeper perspective on that. Like, actually, it's not a great thing to get rid of the transcendent in society. It helps us to think long term. It helps us to think with a desired end in mind. And so, yeah, I think that kind of the Christian view of living, not just a Christian view of theology, not just a Christian view of God, but just a Christian view of life and its purpose and it's what it means to flourish from a Christian perspective. I do think that's what we have to offer the Athens we live in.
In Adventist history, there is the story of Norma and Alma Wiles. They were students at Avondale College in Australia. He took theology and nursing. She took nursing. The two of them ended up on Malakula, an island in what is known today as, when my mind just broke, the New Hebrides. Mm-hmm. And this big headhunter island, they end up learning as much as they can about the Namba language, the Big Nambas, and everybody tells them the Big Nambas are the cannibals on the mountains, don't ever go up there. But once Norman learns enough of the language so that he can communicate with Namba, he takes one of the young boys and walks into the mountains on a trail that no white man has ever used to communicate Christ to the people. And when he got up there, the chief of the Big Namba, rather than killing him, said, "I have had a dream. A man with dead skin comes into my village." And he brought three things. And the first thing he brought was medicine to heal our illness. The second thing he brought was a book that talks about the true God. And the third thing he brought was his love. And you have brought all three. Norman Wiles spent the rest of his life, which didn't last very long. He actually died of malaria he caught on Malakula. But he spent the rest of his life being a brother to the cannibals. And most of it was most of it was on stage 1 and stage 3. The healing processes of helping get them healthy enough to deal with the issues of life. And the third one was just to be there as a brother in service. And the chief, after Norman died, was talking not about God, but about the God Norman loved, the way he loved us. When I think about how to communicate with people today, I wonder if those aren't about the only three tools I really have. A way to heal your pain, something that will give you some insight into to a God that's different than you ever dreamed possible. In your lecture today, you were very clear and wonderful about teaching God as somebody who really likes you. Mm-hmm. He's not a tame lion, you know.
Not a tame lion.
But he really likes you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you got to understand that. Like, we're just so used to saying God is love, God is love, God is love, God is love. But I mean, you got to put yourself in Paul's shoes. Put yourself in a Stoic philosopher's shoes there in the Areopagus. Like, when you have all these Greek gods and these Greek stories about how Zeus is punishing you guys because one of the other gods got fire and gave it to you. You know, it's something you need for your survival, and that makes Zeus angry. And here you're being told about a God who likes you, who loves you, who considers you his children, who wants you to find him, wants to be found by you. I mean, that's just so liberating. What a difference that makes.
One of the comments you made also is that it seems like the gods of the Greeks and maybe that could be extrapolated to the gods all of us have seen and that other people seem to be worshiping, requires something of us. Where the Christian God is the only thing he requires is your ear and your heart to listen and accept his love.
Yeah.
But that's something that's awfully hard to explain to the people around me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to pay tithe, right? God doesn't require much, but the church does.
Oh, yeah. So I do have to pay tithe before he'll really love me? I can't receive that kind of bountiful overflow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I think what's hard is that we don't have statues in society. I mean, we do, and they may come down, but not statues to gods, explicitly to gods. And I think when you walk around today, we still have idols, and there are perhaps invisible monuments we raise to them. Just because we profess atheism or agnosticism doesn't mean we are not enthralled by some kind of God. And what I love about how God presents himself, even though it's in a very particular culture and very particular time, I think God would always define himself. If you were writing a new scripture today, we'll call it the Book of Lucio, and I'll translate it. He always will define himself as freedom compared to whatever the popular gods are that we have around us. Obviously he asked Israel for sacrifices. He obviously asked Israel for tithe. He asked Israel for their time each week in various festivals. But I think, and so on a superficial level, that stuff God asked for looks indistinguishable from the stuff the Greek gods are asking for. But I think the subtle difference is the sacrifice is not for him. It's not to make him happy. It's for you to be forgiven and to be at one with him. And I think if we're just looking at sacrifices in Greece, altar of Zeus, sacrifices in Jerusalem, what's the difference? It all looks the same. And I think our culture makes those kind of superficial comparisons. But when you look a little bit deeper, there's an ocean of difference between the two acts. And I think we have to get back to explaining God in that way. That, yes, you look at the life of a Christian, it's hard. God asks things of you. Fewer people are working, and yet I've never been so busy during COVID, as a pastor, and many, of course, administrators in the same boat. Many others, essential workers, are in the same boat. It's exhausting sometimes. But I think, and so on the superficial level, I think people just see, wow, you're so busy, and you have to do so much, and you have to give so much, and sacrifice so much. It's like, yeah, but you're not seeing what I'm getting, and it's not the paycheck from the conference. You're not seeing what I'm getting on the inside in doing this, in serving him, and maybe we got to do a better job of explaining that.
What are you doing today, every day as a pastor? How do you spend your time?
I spend a lot of time. Last week it was doing another podcast episode. This week it's doing these videos and writing sermons, and we've set it up so the elders are calling people every week. I'm not doing that. But organizing worship is a pain when you don't know who's going to show up at church.
That's right.
And that it's kind of, it weighs on the soul a little bit. A lot of pastors going through some fatigue these days. So pray for your pastor and support them, please. We're just trying to send the message that even during a time of pandemic and rioting and so forth, our God is a God who's worthy of our worship, such as it is, whether there's music or not, whether there's 100 people there or not.
He's listening.
Yeah.
And he gets a little bit of a tear in his eye as he sees what we're doing. Okay, I want to come back to the last question, which is the first question I asked you yesterday. So this evening in downtown Portland, there's going to be a riot. I mean, it is Portland after all. We're at least going to have a protest, okay? And
Yeah, you got to have some sport.
yeah, I want you to come down with me. Jose will finish his sermon at about 9 o'clock. Let's go on down and join the mayor and a variety of others, 2,000 to 3,000 people, and be Paul. What are you going to do?
Well, first step, I think, is you're going to listen, right? So you guys are obviously very familiar with the story going on in Portland. Those of us in the rest of the country maybe don't follow it as closely as you guys do. We have Chicago over here, so we've got...
Give you a few days, you'll be fine.
Yeah, right? So I mean, listen to the people. What are they saying? And I don't believe anybody who paints these riots with a broad brush. You know, all these people in all these cities, they just want to destroy America or whatever it is. It's never like that. You know, when George Floyd was unfortunately murdered, you know, I went and attended some demonstrations, some protests here, and there's a variety of people there for a variety of reasons, right? I'm sure that's true in Portland as well. So I think the first step is to listen to them. And I would, as a pastor, as a Christian, look for ways to intercede between the parties. One of our Adventist pastors, you guys know, over in that neck of the woods, I think memorably to me, had an event where a press conference at his church where he made peace. He was there to facilitate peace between the Bloods and the Crips.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, hey, that's something we Christians can do, right? Like, let's be peacemakers. Let's hear what they're trying to say. You know, you were mentioning earlier as we were talking, the mayor's words were drowned out.
Yeah, right.
There's a time to preach. There's a time to preach, and you may have an opportunity at the protest to preach, maybe. But I think you also preach without using words. You can preach by listening. You can preach by let me hear your concerns, and then being a voice for those people with the other side, you know, with the city, with others. And then vice versa, right? Like, and I think that's kind of our privilege as Christians, is we're not of this world. We're interested in this world and what goes on here, but our ultimate allegiance is not to any flag. So we can afford then to go between. We can afford then to make peace between people.
I love it. Wish you could be here to join me tonight.
Send the conference jet and I'll be happy.
Yeah, that would be no problem. Yeah, that would be no problem. Matt, thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for taking time to put these presentations together for us. Tomorrow we get to point 4, right?
We get to point 4 and then the application.
I'm ready for that. Thanks so much for being with us, and I look forward to tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. This has been our seminar on Acts, Athens, and Apologetics with Matt Lucio of Peoria, Illinois. See you tomorrow.